Among the bills that have Governor Abbott's support is Senate Bill 1515. It would mandate copies of the 10 Commandments inside Texas classrooms. It has already passed the Senate and is awaiting a vote on the floor of the House. For perspective and how the legislation squares with the First Amendment, we turn to constitutional law expert Josh Blackman.
If you had asked me that question about 5 or 10 years ago, I'd say the answer is no. But in light of some recent Supreme Court decision, the answer is maybe. The Supreme Court has been trending more towards allowing more religion in places like schools and other public squares.
And this really started in the 1950s, right, with the In God We Trust, among other things, as a response to communism. Is that historically accurate? When we first started seeing that?
Well, I think there are a couple things that happened in the 1940s and 50s. One was putting the motto "In God We Trust." Also, the Pledge of Allegiance was modified to say "One nation under God." There were certain changes made to bring religion more into the square. But I think the 10 Commandments in particular is a very long heritage. If you go to most courthouses, most government buildings, they have displays of the 10 Commandments. Indeed, at the Texas Capitol, we had this huge granite monument to the 10 Commandments. It has been there for a very long time. But I think for the last 50 or 60 years or so, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. You can't have any religion in the schools. It might coerce students. Keep it away. And that's been the trend for the last half century or so.
So this idea of separation between church and state, is that in the Constitution, or is it just something that has become lore?
The First Amendment says that the government cannot make a law respecting the establishment of religion. That's what it says. And what does it mean to establish religion? Well, one approach is you can't force people to practice one religion over the other. Okay. Another approach is you can't force people to pay for religious services. Okay. But what about having a prayer at the start of a government meeting, or having a copy of the 10 Commandments posted, or having a Christmas tree or a menorah or a creche in a government building, right? These are more difficult questions. Starting in the 1940s and 50s, the Supreme Court said that what the First Amendment means is we must have a strict separation of church and state. That phrase does not appear in the Constitution. Rather, it was taken from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote as president to a group of Baptists. And the meaning of that phrase is widely contested, but not everyone agrees with that. But at least from the 1940s throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and even into the 2010s, the court sort of stuck with the idea that we need to keep this separation of church and state. And the reason why is what we call coercion. That if young children are exposed to religion, they may feel coerced or pressured to participate in that ceremony. So for example, what if a rabbi wants to give a prayer during graduation? A student may feel compelled to stand and show respect to that prayer. Or perhaps a student may say, I don't want to go to graduation. And that was considered unfair. That was the law. Different standard now. We had a case last term at the Supreme Court involving a football coach in Washington State. And the coach would say a prayer before the start of games. He didn't make his players join him. He would sort of pray quietly at the 50-yard line. But it turns out many players joined him. And some players said, well, you know, I thought if I want to get more playing time, then maybe I should join this coach. The Supreme Court said that's not enough. Right? The mere fact that students may feel pressure because of the prayer is not enough to declare it unconstitutional. So in light of this precedent from the Washington football coach, the 10 Commandments issue, I think, is live, and it may be a different way than it would have been 30 or 40 years ago.
My guess would be that should it pass, if it does, it would immediately be challenged.
Immediately.
And it would find its way ultimately to the Supreme Court.
Right.
Given the current makeup of the court, I'm assuming that's part of the reason that you're suggesting it's a fair and open question.
Right, and the law is crafted in somewhat of a very specific manner, and it doesn't require the school districts to pay for the 10 Commandment displays. It says they must accept donations, so it actually wouldn't even cost the school districts a penny. But this will be challenged immediately in Houston, and Austin, and Dallas, and all the other places in our state. And I think what the Texas legislature is hoping is that the new Supreme Court will treat this law differently. We saw this with abortion, and we've seen this with other areas where the court has sort of reversed older precedents.
Anything else you think it's worth adding in this discussion about separation between church and state and the 10 Commandments in particular?
Well, there's another bill pending in the House involving prayer. That one is actually perhaps more significant. This bill would allow school districts to approve a prayer before the day begins. Now, critically, they don't have to. So if Houston doesn't want it, they won't have it in Houston. If Dallas doesn't want it, they won't have it in Dallas. But if smaller school districts in the state choose, they can have a prayer. And it's in a very precise manner in which parents have to basically opt in to allow the students to hear the prayer. In other words, unless a student opts in, there'll be no prayer. So students who might complain about it will never be exposed to the prayer. And even since you can't broadcast the prayer on the PA system, it's got to be only for those people who opt in. So this will make it very hard to challenge in court. I see this bill as actually the trickier one because it's actually a prayer rather than just a symbol on the wall that people can ignore every day.
And would this conform or perhaps be lawful in part because on a lot of high school campuses you have FCA, Fellowship of Christian Athletes, where they'll gather before school and pray. That's opt-in.
Right. The difference is this is actually sponsored by the school itself and not by an extracurricular organization. And I think what they're trying to do is allow smaller school districts, which maybe have a higher percentage of religious kids, to pray quietly before school starts, out of the earshot of people who can object to it. Teachers who don't want to participate won't have to, so it'll be a very self-selecting group. This bill, combined with the Ten Commandments bill, would really sort of test the Supreme Court's precedents concerning religion in schools.